Anticipation is a strange thing. If it's something good that you're anticipating, that you're looking forward to, I remember, since it's still pretty fresh on my mind, looking forward to a certain date I had with a certain young lady in Florida about a year ago. It's something that's exciting, something that is, in a sense, maybe even positive things still can be kind of nerve-wracking, especially if it's something like getting married or something like that. On the other hand, if you're anticipating, meaning looking towards something that's negative, there can be a lot of fear, there can be a lot of searching for a way out. A lot of times we think about, as we just sang about, Jesus in the garden praying, "Not my will, but yours be done." And we think about maybe the events that led up directly to that, but remember, this is not an anticipation, a looking towards that only started even a few weeks earlier as he begins his journey to Jerusalem. He knew very early on, before his ministry even started, why he was here, what he had come to do. And so when he comes to the garden, before he is about to be arrested, as he knows he is about to be, what we see there with Jesus coming before the Father, praying, asking, even we might say begging, for any other way to be found to accomplish the salvation of mankind. When he says, "Not my will, but yours be done," but if it is possible, if there's any way, that is the culmination of a literal lifetime of anticipation. An anticipation of something that is not going to be fun. Anticipation of something that is going to be horrifying. That is not going to be quick. And that also, in a sense, was avoidable. If you look at Matthew 26, once the people come to arrest Jesus, the mob, if you will, comes, as they're sometimes described. They come to arrest Jesus. Judas comes up and kisses Jesus on the cheek to identify him before this group that has been sent. And Jesus, of course, is preparing to submit and to go with them. And Peter, he's not going to stand for this. This is the moment. This is the time when the revolution begins. And so he draws his sword. We're told shortly before this there were 2 swords among the 12. Well, Peter has one of them. Big surprise. He's a man of action. He's going to draw his sword and he cuts off someone's ear. He's ready. He's going to fight. He's going to defend his master. Do you remember what Jesus says in verse 53? Starting actually, let's look at verse 52. He says, "Put your sword back into its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword." This isn't how we're going to handle this, Peter. But notice verse 53. "Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels?" Someone, I don't know that it's actually an accurate number, someone has translated this, the term we're probably more familiar with, 10,000 angels. Now, legion usually had about 6,000, so he's actually talking about a bigger number even than 10,000, but for the sake of what we're familiar with, let's just say 10,000. 12 legions of angels, 10,000 angels. He's saying, I could call that many angels immediately, just like that. And they would be here surrounding this garden, rescuing me from what's about to happen. In other words, I don't need you, Peter. You're just a man. I could have armies of heavenly hosts at my fingertips just with a simple word. Now, I would submit to you, Jesus wouldn't even need that. He could conquer the entire world. I'm talking physically. He could conquer the entire world on his own. He's powerful enough to do that. One angel by themselves at Jesus' command could accomplish that. And yet, he says, I have the ability, the authority even, to call 10,000 angels. But he didn't. He had that ability, but he didn't. I want us, just for a few minutes tonight, to think about what we would have done if we had that ability and were in Jesus' position. If you know, in fact, have known your whole life that you're going to have to suffer and even die to save people who don't even want you, who don't even like you, to save even some of the people who are going to be the ones murdering you. If you know your entire life that's going to happen, and yet when the moment comes, you have the ability to stop it. And not just stop it. Let's be honest, stop it in one of the coolest ways possible in the mind of a person anyway. The mind of a human being. Can you imagine how awesome, how amazing, how majestic it would be to see an army of angels fighting against evil men? To have that ability. If you and I were in this position, don't you think we'd probably do it? I want us to think, again, for just a few minutes, about why we would be tempted to do it, just like he was. I want to avoid suffering, just like he did. He didn't want to suffer. He didn't want to go through all this. That's why he prays, if there's any other way, let's do it that way. Because while yes, he's God, well, yes, he knows this is the plan, he's also human. He doesn't want to go through this. If there's another way, can we change the plan? Now, if there's no other way, as we see, he's going to go through with it. But he doesn't enjoy the thought of suffering. You know, we have a lot of problems in our lives. I don't know that many of them qualify as suffering. I forget what it was. There was something about 2 feet too far away for us to grab from the couch yesterday. And I was leaning over trying to grab it. I couldn't reach it. And I just looked at Liz. I was like, oh, this is frustrating. How much suffering have I just endured? We have a lot of what we call first world problems, right? I'm not saying we haven't also experienced real suffering. But when it comes to real suffering, if I'm just annoyed at the things that inconvenience me, if I'm just annoyed when the internet goes out, if I'm just annoyed when I get a flat tire, well, I certainly don't want to have to go through real suffering. I'll certainly do whatever I can to avoid real suffering. Or at least I'll be tempted to. Now, I don't want to do something that's wrong to avoid suffering, but depending on how severe the suffering, the temptation is going to be a lot stronger now, isn't it? I don't want to suffer. I want to avoid suffering. And brethren, Jesus did too. Jesus did too. All the way back in Isaiah 53, that Jesus, by the way, quotes from throughout his ministry, we're told that the Messiah would be despised. He would be rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. I don't know about y'all, but I read that and I wish that prophecy was about me, right? I wish that prophecy was describing the life I'm going to... No, I don't wish that. I don't want that description of me. I don't want my life to be that. I don't want to suffer. In fact, the discrepancy between that description of the Messiah and other descriptions of the Messiah as a conquering hero and so forth were exactly why many Jews couldn't wrap their minds around it being the same person. They split up into two different people. There's the suffering servant. He's going to come somewhere in the picture. And then there's the Messiah who's going to actually be the king. They can't be the same person. Because how could the conquering hero endure so much suffering? And if he's a conquering hero... And I think really this is where their logic went. If he's the conquering hero, why would he allow himself to suffer? He has the power to stop it. Well, guess what? Jesus was a conquering hero, not in the way they expected, but he was. And he did have the power to stop it. And he also had the motivation to stop it. Because he didn't want to suffer. And yet he didn't stop it. In 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 22 through 29, we see Paul describing all that he went through as an apostle of the Lord. He's saying this to try and show, by contrast, all these others who are trying to kind of discredit him or put him down. He's saying, okay, they want to boast? Let me tell you about me. Let me tell you about what I've done. I've been beaten. I've been shipwrecked. I've been persecuted. I've been run out of town on a rail. I've been all these things I've been through. And I did it all for the sake of the Lord. Now, I ask you, do you think Paul enjoyed any of those events in his life? From the very beginning of his conversion, right after he is converted, people are already trying to kill him. Within a few days. And that didn't stop for the rest of his life until eventually, based on what we know historically, he was killed for his faith. He didn't want to suffer. From a human perspective, he would have wanted to avoid that. And yet Jesus, Peter, in fact, every single one of the apostles, not to mention the majority of the early Christians, because almost all of the early Christians in particular suffered immense persecution in one way or another, they didn't choose to avoid it because they had an option, didn't they? They had an option, and we'll come back to that. Why? They wanted to avoid it, but they didn't. Well, remember what Paul says in Romans 8 and verse 18? The sufferings of this present life are not worthy to be compared with the glory that awaits us. And yet, the fact remains, no matter how noble the cause may be, I don't enjoy suffering. So, would I have called 10,000 angels? They would have avoided suffering. No matter how noble the cause may be, I don't enjoy suffering. That's a pretty appealing thing when you're in that position. Well, secondly, I have reasons to do what I prefer, just like he did. Not only do I just want to avoid the suffering, there were reasons Jesus could have come up with to defend calling the angels, going ahead with that version of the plan, if you even want to call it that at that point. You know, I think about growing up, speaking of Mother's Day, kids become very good usually at finding ways to convince their parents that their idea or what they want to do is the best option, right? I became a master at saying, okay, listen, here's why what I would like to do will benefit you. Here's why you want to order in pizza tonight, right? Kids are good at that, and as adults, we still retain that ability usually. Convincing our spouse, convincing our boss or something like that to do what we want to do, because we can always come up for a reason to do what we want to do. Even to make it a good thing to do or the right thing to do. Jesus had reasons he could cite. Now, they weren't valid enough to justify calling the angels. But he could have brought things out. He could have said, well, my followers, the ones that you've entrusted to me, are in danger if I don't do this. Not just me. I need to defend them. Or he could have said, well, there is another way. I can actually literally take over the world with these angels and then teach everyone, force everyone, even if I need to follow God. Or maybe say, well, I asked God, please let this cup pass from me. Now, he didn't answer me directly, but maybe Peter drawing his sword, maybe that's a sign. Maybe this is the sign from God that I need, and this is okay, I can do this. Any of those things could have been used as a justification. Remember, Jesus is human. I would argue this is one, I know we have the record of the temptation, but I would argue this is one of the most tempting moments in Jesus' entire life. He has the option. And he has things he can use to justify it. In 1 Samuel chapter 13, verses 11 through 12, do you remember what Saul said? He's about to go to war against the Philistines. And he's called for Samuel the prophet to come and to sacrifice to the Lord before they go to battle. But Samuel's delayed. We're not really told why, but for whatever reason, Samuel's delayed. Could have been a number of things. Saul doesn't want to go into this battle without seeking the Lord's counsel, seeking the Lord's advice. But he's not qualified to make the sacrifice. Only a priest, only a Levite can do that. But time's running out. So he goes ahead and offers the sacrifice. And Samuel comes just a little bit later and says, "What have you done?" And Saul says, "Well, I needed to seek the Lord's counsel." "What, you want me not to seek the Lord's counsel? That wouldn't be right." He comes up with a way to justify his choice. In Luke chapter 10 and verse 29, remember the man asking Jesus what the greatest commandments are. He answers, as we even mentioned in class this morning, love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. But you remember what the man says next? Well, not even he says it. Luke tells us this about him. It says, the man wanting to justify himself asked, "Who is my neighbor?" Give me some kind of reason that I can use to still keep on treating people the way I want to treat them. Maybe I can mess around with the definition of what a neighbor is and do it that way. Give me some reason to keep on doing what I prefer. Going back to the temptations of Jesus. In Matthew chapter 4, verses 1 through 11. Those three temptations, you remember? Turn the rocks into bread, cast yourself down, worship me. Each of those things are accompanied by a reason. The first one, it's not spelled out for us in terms of Satan saying anything specific, but if you went without food for 40 days, do you think that you can convince yourself you have a reason to get some food? I think so. You think if someone's quoting scripture at you, whether they're misquoting or not, they use scripture. So surely that's reason enough for me to do what they're saying. We can always come up with reasons. I can always find reasons to do or to believe that what I want is right. And Jesus, he could have done the same thing here in the garden. He has the option of calling these angels to save him from what's about to happen. And he could have come up with reasons to justify it. But he didn't. Yes, I can always find reasons to believe that what I want is right. But I also know deep down what is actually right. But thirdly, we already alluded to this. I have a choice. When it comes to putting myself in this position, would I call 10,000 angels? Wouldn't I? I have a choice, just like he did. Sometimes we emphasize the fact that Jesus was God so much that we almost overlook the fact he had a choice. He could have called these angels. He could have given into temptation. He could have sinned. Now, it would have essentially destroyed the world if he had done that. But it was a choice he had at his disposal. The power of him refusing to call the angels was the fact that he was able to in the first place. Whenever I think about this scene and Jesus expressing this about himself, I think about like spy movies or war movies where someone's taken prisoner and they're being interrogated. Sometimes the good guy, sometimes the bad guy, depending on the movie. But either way, they're going through a lot of pain in this interrogation, right? Maybe they're being tortured, depending on the situation. And throughout the whole thing, what is the interrogator almost always saying to them? Just tell us what we need to know. This can all stop. This can all stop just like that. Just tell us what we need to know. Not only will it stop, we'll make things great for you. We'll give you a hot meal. We'll give you a nice warm bed. It can all stop. Just choose the right thing. That's the choice Jesus had. This can all stop before it even starts. Just call the angels. Just stop it. In Matthew chapter 7, toward the end of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus gives one of the most well-known, I guess you could say, images of what it means to follow Christ, painting this picture of two ways or two roads. A narrow way, a narrow path, a difficult path, but one that leads to life. Or a broad, well-paved, well-traveled path that leads to destruction. I think about trails that I've hiked. Usually the ones that are in worse condition are the ones that lead to better places. The ones that are actually paved trails or something like that, they have too many people on them. And when you get there, there's people crowd around. And it's not as cool as the little trail off and into nowhere that no one's around. And you get to be alone and see some beautiful aspect of nature. But we have a choice. We can follow either path. One is definitely easier, and one is definitely more difficult. We're not under any illusion about that fact. What do you think would have been easier for Jesus? As he's sitting there in the garden, or standing there, I guess he'd gotten up at this point. He sees these people coming. What do you think would have been easier for him to do? I guarantee you, a one-word command to a legion of angels sounds a whole lot easier than choosing to go through what he was about to go through, what he knew he was about to go through. And he did anyway. Later on, again, at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, he gives that example of the wise man and the foolish man. Both hear the word, but one chooses to follow it, to obey it, and the other one doesn't. But there's a choice. There's always that choice. In fact, we're told, even in the most difficult, most overwhelming of temptations, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10:13, we always have a choice. There's always a way of escape provided. We are never forced to sin. And in fact, very often, choosing to sin is the easier choice. And yet we always have the choice either to sin or not. The narrow way is far more difficult. And I am not forced to walk it. Now, that doesn't mean I can get to the destination of the narrow way without walking it. But I'm not forced to walk down the narrow way. I have a choice, just like Jesus did. So picture yourself in the garden. You know this is God's will. You know you can help people. I don't want us to go too far. Obviously, Jesus and us are very different, but think about it from a human perspective. You know this is God's will, but you know you're going to go through terrible suffering. And you can end it just like that. Would you have called the 10,000 angels? I want to say I wouldn't have. I think I probably would have. What does that mean? That means I have work to do. That means we have work to do. Yes, I don't enjoy suffering. Yes, I am very capable of coming up with reasons to do what I want. Yes, I have a choice. So my job is to work on myself. My job is to build my character, my dedication, my service, to the point where I could say that I would respond just like he did. Even with all the same fears, temptations, motivations, whenever I encounter suffering, I should follow the example of my Savior. not taking the easy way out, but being willing to endure whatever it takes so that God's will be done and not mine. If there's anything we can do to help you this evening, please let it be known as we stand and sing.